Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the presentation of the colors and remain standing for the playing of the United States National Anthem by the United States Army Brass Quintet.
Port, hoot! Colors turn, march.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Gray, Director of the National Museum of American History.
Thank you very much. And tonight I'm here to welcome you to your National Museum of American History and to thank all of you for joining us. We welcome and thank an American soldier statesman, General Colin Powell, our nation's 65th Secretary of State and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and National Security Advisor. Today marks the 75th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. At the National World War II Memorial, a candlelight vigil is being held where the names of 2,403 men and women were killed that day. It's been read. The greatest generation emerged from the sacrifice and the service to this era. They inspired the next generation of leaders, like General Powell, all focused on strengthening democracy at home and around the world. Your National Museum is dedicated to exploring the ideals and ideas of America, like democracy, opportunity, and freedom, to create the most engaging, interesting, and inclusive American history that helps people understand the past to make sense of the present and shape a more humane future. Next summer, as part of a 15-year, $600 million reinvention of every facet of our work, we'll reopen a new floor dedicated to the nation we build together on the floor below us. Addressing the most pressing issues of our time, we ask the fundamental question, what does it mean to be American? Our two keystone exhibitions, American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith, and Many Voices, One Nation, on the peopling of America, demonstrate how we must all be active participants in our vibrant democracy and how our many communities have negotiated with each other to forge one nation. Welcoming our millions of visitors to this new floor is Horatio Greeno's stunning 12-ton marble statue of George Washington, which once stood in the Capitol Rotunda. We looked upon him as we gathered earlier in front of the Star-Spangled Banner. The classical Greek statuary dramatically symbolizes liberty and democracy. But most importantly, we see the sword in Washington's outstretched hand, celebrating how our first president, after leading the country to victory, relinquished power to the people. President Washington was our first and greatest of a long distinguished tradition of distinctly American soldier-statesmen who have played a role in nearly every facet of the development of our nation. And every great American takes inspiration from General Washington's example. We thank our board member and renowned numismatist, Jeff Garrett. Jeff commissioned and donated the extraordinary solid gold medal that we will present to General Powell. The medal is inspired by our 1905 $20 double eagle on prominent display on the first floor, designed by the famous sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. And we express our sincere gratitude to our alumni board member and Smithsonian Regent Chair-elect, David Rubenstein. We applaud your astonishing interest in every facet of American history, your agile mind and powerful intellect, and your never-ending drive to make American history through this museum and so many historic American places relevant and important. David, you described yourself as an interviewer with a day job, but you bring the most important stories to life like no other. So, who is a great American and why? Tonight we will learn more about America's ideals and ideas from this conversation between David and General Powell. But first, let's learn more about this great American.
We shouldn't ask for glory for what we've done. We should find that our service is its own rewards.
America turned to Colin Powell first as a soldier, then as a statesman, a four-star general, and the first African-American Secretary of State. Our nation has been enriched by Colin Powell's dedication.
I love this country with all my heart, with all my soul. I am proud to be an American.
Born in the South Bronx to Jamaican immigrants, Colin grew up in Harlem. His father a shipping clerk, his mother a seamstress.
My immigrant parents, who were poor, had expectations for me and my sister to do better.
He attended public schools in New York City from kindergarten through college, graduating with a degree in geology from City College of New York. It was here Powell joined the ROTC, which he said was one of the happiest experiences of his life. Posted to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic training, Powell quickly discovered the rest of the United States wasn't like New York.
Once you got south of Baltimore, you were in a different part of our country, a part of our country that was still segregated, a part of our country where racial discrimination and Jim Crow was rife.
But the Army was more integrated than other institutions, and Powell thrived.
The Army has invested in me. It has taken chances on me. It has cared for me.
Deployed to Vietnam twice, promoted to commander of the 5th Corps in Germany, appointed National Security Advisor to President Reagan, General Powell, the soldier's soldier, made an impression. In 1989, he was awarded his 4th star and became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the youngest ever to achieve that appointment.
One of the most fundamental aspects of our approach to the future should be a resolute determination to reshape history and to work for a permanent peace.
As the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, General Powell oversaw 28 foreign crises, including Operation Desert Storm. It was during this conflict in Kuwait and Iraq that General Powell, along with General Schwarzkopf, became familiar to households around the world. Powell was nicknamed the Reluctant Warrior for his desire to use diplomacy over military intervention. These objectives became known as the Powell Doctrine.
Always remember, have a clear mission of what you're trying to achieve. Don't overreach. Make sure the political means match the military means, and then go in and get it done. Get it done and do it decisively.
Powell's uniform, seen often in military briefings during the conflict, has been donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History.
Chairman Powell, your commitment and good counsel, your deep compassion for every one of the thousands of men and women under your command will always be remembered.
The general was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1991 as well as in 1993, one of only 2 double recipients. After nearly 4 decades of service, General Powell retired from the Army.
Today, a grateful nation observes the end of a distinguished career.
For Powell, it was another defining moment.
I have never wanted to be anything but a soldier, and my dream has been fulfilled for almost 4 decades. I find myself on this beautiful afternoon the most fortunate man.
In 1995, he wrote a best-selling memoir and then dedicated his efforts to improving the lives of children, founding the charity America's Promise.
If you work hard, then you have a chance to go up. But you gotta believe, you gotta get an education.
But once again, a nation called for Colin Powell's service. In 2001, he was confirmed as the 65th Secretary of State. Just months after taking office, the United States was attacked on 9/11. After the tragedy, Powell became one of President Bush's closest advisors, working tirelessly to solve regional and civil conflicts.
We must always advocate our belief in democracy, our belief in human rights, our belief in the will of the people.
After leaving the State Department in 2005, Powell and his wife Alma have been dedicated to helping children in the United States reach their full potential.
It ain't so much where you start in life, it's what you do with life that will determine where you end up in life.
8 elementary schools are named after Powell, and his alma mater, City College of New York, established the Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. From the Cold War to the global war on terror, in the service of 4 presidents, America has relied on Colin Powell.
All you can ever leave behind is your reputation, your good works, and the next generation of children for the nation. And let your dreams be your only limitation.
His accomplishments are an inspiration. His story is a part of American history.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Rubenstein and General Colin Powell.
Well, it's going to be hard to top that video.
Thank you very much.
So I'm just curious, when you were growing up in the South Bronx, your parents are immigrants from Jamaica. Did you ever expect to live a life of the type that you've led?
I get this question very, very often. You know, when you were growing up in the South Bronx, a child of immigrants, both my parents came here on banana boats from Jamaica, born in Harlem, living in the South Bronx. Did you dream you could grow up and become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or Secretary of State? And I kind of smile and say, yeah, there I was. I was about 10 years old, standing on the corner of 163rd and Kelly Street. I said to myself, so if you're going to grow up and become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In those days, we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s, it was beyond any possible level of aspiration that I might have had. Public school kid, no military academy, couldn't even have dreamed of going to West Point. And most of the major military schools that were in the South would not have allowed a black person to go to those schools. But it happened, and it happened because, one, I had a family that kept me in play, a family that said, keep going, keep going. I was not a great student, but they still believed in me. And I learned that a good public school education could carry you far. That's why I'm so committed to public school education now.
Well, we'll talk about your career as you went through it, but did your parents live to see your accomplishments?
Not entirely. My father died before I got promoted to general, but my mother was there the day I was promoted to brigadier general, 1-star. And my family for years have been saying, why does he stay in the Army? Why doesn't he get out? He's been to Vietnam twice, he's been hurt twice.
Right.
But when my mother stood there next to me and the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, as my stars were being pinned on me and Alma pinned on one, from that day on, it was my son the general. You know, it couldn't be my son the doctor, so my son the general.
So speaking of my son, the doctor, you grew up in an environment where you worked, and you worked, as you've said before, in a store that was owned by people who were Jewish, and you learned Yiddish then. So was that unusual for people who are African American to learn Yiddish, or?
For some African Americans, yes, but not for me. The block I grew up on, it was pretty much one block, Kelly Street, the 900 block of Kelly Street. But it was just a remarkable environment. Almost everybody was a minority of one kind or another. We had a Jewish drugstore owner. We had Kaiserman the baker, another Jew. I was a Sabbath goy at the synagogue across the street. There was Lowenstein's candy store. There was a Puerto Rican bodega, a Chinese laundry. Everybody was from somewhere else, and everybody was a minority. And so I grew up in this incredibly diverse environment. And then one day I tripped over this gentleman by the name of Jacob Sixer, who was the owner of a toy store, and he asked me to come schlep some boxes, you know, move some boxes around. I said yes, and he liked the way I worked, paid me, I think, 25 cents an hour. And for 7 years, I worked on and off with him. But the story I've often told about Jake is that he stopped me one day after I'd been there a few years, on and off, after school in the summer. And he said, Collie, it was a nickname he had to me. It was kind of a Yiddish diminutive of Colin. Collie, new. I want you should know the store will go to the family. I don't want you should think that you have a career here. I never thought I had a career there. But I was so touched that he took the time and he was thinking about this and thought enough of me to say, you get your education and you move on. You got a good family. And I've never forgotten, and I've written about it many times, I've told the story many times, that this one person touched me and had an influence on my life. And after he passed on, it did move on to other members of the family. His son-in-law took it over. And the closure of the story is that when I became National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, President Reagan, his son had retired to Palm Beach, of course.
Of course. It's a suburb of New York.
You got it. And it was in the newspaper that I'd be the named chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or National Security Advisor. And so he reads it in the Palm Beach newspaper. He says, oi, that's the kid. That's the kid who we brought up. We made this kid. And for the rest of his life, every time I was in Palm Beach, I would go to the Breakers and sit in the lobby of the Breakers with him and his wife. And he would just sit there with me. And as people came by, he would stop. I want you should meet Collie. And until he died. And so I've never forgotten that. And I did pick up some Yiddish, which I've used to great effect over the years. And I once had a meeting with Prime Minister Shamir when I was chairman right after Desert Storm. Private meeting in Jerusalem with the Prime Minister of Israel. Nobody knew what was going on in the room. Meeting ended, I came out, said nothing to the staff outside. Shamir, always closed mouth as usual, said nothing. So they had to make up something. So they decided to call New York right away, which always happens after you've had a meeting in Jerusalem. And they called, you want to hear what? They were there for an hour. They talked entirely in Yiddish. Why should I fool with a story like that? I mean, I've been going to lunch on it for the last 25 years.
So you went to...
I do speak a little Yiddish, just a bissel.
Probably more than I do, but CCNY. You went there because it's inexpensive, right? Your family couldn't afford to send you some fancy place, I guess, or fancier, I'd say.
True.
You majored in geology. Did you think you were going to be an oil person, or why were you majoring in geology?
Because I busted out of engineering.
Oh. Okay.
And my mother wanted me to become a civil engineer. What did she know from? I didn't know anything about it. But after a few months, it was not agreeing with me.
Okay.
And so I had to leave civil engineering. But the thought of quitting college was unthinkable in my family. If I'd gone home and said, I'm dropping out, I don't want any more, they would have said, we're going to drop you out, get another kid, we don't need this. And so I had to stay in college, and I was only 17, I just turned 17. And so I took geology, and it was the easiest one, rocks for jocks.
Right.
But it was at that point that I also saw the ROTC cadets.
Right.
And I saw these young men marching up and down Convent Avenue in uniform, and it appealed to me. You know, today is the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Well, I was only 4 years old at that time, and I was about 8 years old when the war ended, and we immediately went into the Cold War and nuclear Armageddon possibilities. And then by the time I entered college, we were through the Korean War. So there was such a military background to my growing up that the ROTC appealed to me. It gave me structure, it gave me a sense of belonging, it gave me a second family, really. And so I put all my passion into it, and I realized I wasn't as slow as I thought I might be in college, because I got straight A's in ROTC. They blended them into my overall grade point average, brought me up to 2.0, and I graduated from CCNY as a cadet colonel.
Okay, so you were in the ROTC. Now, when you're in ROTC, you have an obligation for, I said, was it 4 or
3
5?
years.
3 years.
3 years
okay.
at the time.
So after 3 years, you could have left the military and
left.
gone on and become something important like a private equity investor or something like that, right? But you decided not to do that, right?
Yeah, but by then I had become a professional soldier. I had been to every course the infantry school had. I was a paratrooper, I was a pathfinder, I was a ranger. It was my profession. And even though my relatives were uneasy about it, they finally realized that this is what he's going to do. And my wife and I had to go visit our senior aunt in the family. Every family has a senior aunt. And Aunt Larice was going to talk us out of the Army. You know, the whole family's worried. You've been hurt twice. You're going to be killed if you go back. Oh my God, you got to get out. But we convinced her by simply saying, you know, Larice, that I can retire after 20 years at age 41 with 50% of my pension. Stay.
Right. Well,
It's better than the post office. Stay. And they didn't bother us after that.
well, my father worked in the post office, and I know what that's like. You can retire when you're 55, and you get a pension. But
But I really was a professional soldier. It's what my passion was. And I use it when I talk to kids. Find your passion. If you do it well, and it's what you love doing, and you think you're serving, that's what you go for.
well, you mentioned your wife, who is here. Alma is right here. Thank you very much, Alma. Where did you meet your wife? And is it true that her family didn't think you were quite good enough for her?
Yes, that's true. She ought to tell this part of the story, but we met on a blind date. A friend of mine took me on a blind date to cut out his girlfriend, her roommate. We were both 2 officers stationed at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. Alma was working for the Boston Guild for the Hard of Hearing, and she was rooming with another charming lady. And so I went in this blind date. She did not like blind dates. She didn't think it was appropriate. She came from a very proper Southern family. And so she was all set to, dismiss me as soon as I walked in. But I walked in and we hit it off. As she tells the story, she went and washed her face, came back in and was looking like a proper Southern lady and not like a vamp. It worked out.
But her family was happy with this?
Well, I wouldn't quite put it that way. Her mother met me. I knew her mother quite well, but I had never met her father. And then in August, I guess it was, of 1962, I got orders to Vietnam. One of the first group of advisors going in under President Kennedy. And I drove into her apartment in Boston. I was from Fort Devens, about an hour out, and told her I was going to Vietnam and it's going to be a year. I'll be away for a whole year. I hope you'll write me. And she just looked at me and said, you hope I'll write you? Yes. She said, well, I won't. I said, a year? That's it? That's all there is? And so I drove back to Fort Devens and realized, you're about to make a big mistake, don't make it. Went back in, asked if she would marry me. We were married 10 days later, I guess it was, in Birmingham, Alabama. Her parents were given 10 days to get ready. And I went to Birmingham in uniform with the best man, a friend of mine, Ronnie Brooks, who's passed on. My mother and father came, my sister and brother-in-law came. Her whole family was there. And her father looked at me rather disapprovingly. Even as he stood next to us in the wedding photo, you could see his disapproving look. Because as he often said, and Alma won't mind, I don't think if I say this, he said, all my life, I've tried to stay away from West Indians, and now she's gone and married one. But he and I became the very best of friends until he passed on, and it was a wonderful family arrangement.
So the segregated South, was it easy to find a hotel for a honeymoon here?
Well, yeah, there was a black hotel in Birmingham. That was the only
was it?
hotel we could go to. You know, it's interesting because in those days, mid-50s and early 60s, before 64, the military was the most socially progressive institution in America. So I could be stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, with Alma and our infant child, Michael. And Columbus, Georgia was right outside the gate. And on Fort Benning, it was totally integrated. Army said, we're going to do it. And you dare not speak against what we were doing with respect to integration, even though there was resistance. But as soon as you drove out the gate, you were back in the segregated South. I was thrown out of hamburger joints. I was stopped by a cop in Sylacauga, Alabama one night. He thought I was speeding on my way from Birmingham, where Alma was, back to Fort Benning. And I was driving my Volkswagen that I brought home from Germany a couple of years earlier. And he stopped me, and he was about to give me a ticket, but he walked around the car. He saw this foreign car, German car. He saw this black guy driving it. He saw the New York license plate, and he saw an LBJ all the way sticker. And he walked around to me and he said, boy, you better get out of here as fast as you can. And I did. But that was the South then. And I think Al and I will both always remember when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed in July of that year. And I was able to go back down to the hamburger place that had thrown me out and got a hamburger. It was a burden that was lifted not just off African Americans, but off all of America, especially a burden lifted off white Americans, a burden they'd been carrying for so many years. But the problem is not solved, it's not over. There's still residual problems that we're dealing with, and we see it every day in our public life now. But we've come a long way since 1958.
Well, you went to Vietnam, and when you were in Vietnam initially, you were injured. I thought in those days when you were injured in Vietnam, you could come back to the States and then you did not have to go back because you had been injured on the first tour of duty. Is that right or wrong? Or
No, that's
that wasn't
wrong.
true? So you had no choice, but you had to go back a second time?
I had to go back, but it was a 4-year break before I went back.
I see.
And the first time, it was a minor injury. I stepped in a punji trap and put a spike through my foot. But it was minor.
Minor?
Yeah, it really was minor.
I get a toenail chin. I think that's a problem.
And the second time, when I went back, you have to go back. You're a professional soldier. You don't argue about these matters.
Right. So you came back after the second tour of duty.
Yeah,
Eventually,
after having crashed a helicopter, right? Yeah.
you survived the crash in the helicopter.
Yeah.
When it was going down, did you think you were going to survive, or?
We were landing in a place we shouldn't have been landing, coming down through the trees. And I was with the commanding general. I was the operations officer for the division. And as we came down, I was looking out the left side door. And I didn't like where we were going. I was about to tell the pilot, get us out of here, when the wind shifted as he went down through the trees, and I saw the blade hit a tree about 100 feet up. And when a helicopter blade hits a tree, it stops immediately. You're no longer in a helicopter, you're in a falling rock. And the helicopter fell, broke apart, started to smolder, and I was able to jump out. I had a broken ankle and some other lacerations. I was able to help some of the others out.
Did everybody survive?
Everybody survived. The one guy I worried about was the general's aide. He was by the radio console, and when the helicopter hit, the engine came down and smashed his head into the console. And I thought he was dead. But when I went in to pull him out before it caught fire, he moaned. And he had a helmet on, and the helmet saved him. And he was okay in several days. He was unconscious for a while.
So when you came back to the States, you ultimately won something called a White House Fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And what did you do as a White House Fellow? Where did you work? In the White House itself, or?
I worked in the Office of Management and Budget, and I was very glad to be there because it gave me an opportunity to see the entire government and not just one department. So I worked there as a special assistant to the deputy director, a fellow you know very well, by the name of Fred Malik.
Right.
And in the course of that, I met other people such as Roy Ash, Cap Weinberger, George Schultz, and a lot of other people, and I was just a lieutenant colonel in the Army. I also had the opportunity to travel to both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, which was a rare thing for an American Army lieutenant colonel to be doing in a single year. And that gave me exposure to the enemy. And I realized these are people. And I came away from both of those trips understanding that, things are going to change. And that stuck with me for the rest of my time. But I was exposed to a much broader world, not only the United States government and all its parts, but China, Bulgaria, Germany, and a lot of other places, and especially the Soviet Union.
So you stayed in the military after your White House fellowship, and ultimately President Carter was elected, and I believe you served as an assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Defense then, Charles Duncan.
Yep. I served with Charles Duncan, Graham Claytor, who used to be Secretary of the Navy. I even went with Charles Duncan over to the Energy Department when Mr. Carter sent him over there for a brief period. And then I crawled my way back to the Pentagon and finally got out of the Pentagon back to troops.
I remember I was in the Carter White House, and one time I had a meeting with Charles Duncan, and you were sitting there, and I said, this looks like the unhappiest man I've ever met, because it looked like you wanted to be in the Department of Energy. You wanted to be in the military part of the government.
Yeah, it was a challenge during the latter part of my military career. I had developed a reputation for working in civilian offices as a military officer. And it stuck with me. And every time I got away from that and got out to the field again to do my professional work as an infantry officer, I found myself jerked back into a civilian appointment. And this was the most important turning point of my career when Iran-Contra came along during the Reagan administration. And we needed to do something to stabilize the last 2 years of President Reagan's administration. And one of the things they did after cleaning up the NSC, Frank Carlucci was asked to be the National Security Advisor. By now, I'm happy in Germany commanding a corps of 70,000 troops on the Iron Curtain. And after Frank gets appointed, I get a phone call from Frank in my magnificent office in Germany. And Frank, how are you? Congratulations, you're going to do a great job as National Security Advisor. He said, but I want you to come back. Come back? What do you mean come back? To do what? I want you to be my deputy. I said, Frank, you can't do this to me. You're ruining my career. You're screwing up my career again. He says, it's that important. So I figured, why not play your last card, Powell? I said, if it's that important, why don't you have the president call me now? 30 minutes later, hello? General Powell, this is Ron Reagan. And I can see him reading the notes that had been prepared for him. And so Elm and I were on our way back to Washington a week later.
So you became the Deputy National Security Advisor, which has one of the smaller offices in Washington.
It's the smallest office in Washington. Right.
So you did that, and then Frank became the Secretary of Defense.
Right.
And you became the National Security Advisor.
Yes, but it's interesting. When Frank moved to the Department of Defense, replacing my beloved friend Cap Weinberger, who I'd worked for a number of years, I said, good, I can get out of here now. Because I was still an active duty officer. And I was a 3-star active duty officer. And so I said, get out of here now. But there was a lot of whispering going on. Howard Baker was the chief of staff, and he was asking me what I wanted to do. And went to an NFC meeting, and the president hadn't arrived yet, and neither had Frank. And I was chairing it at the other end of the table from where the president's supposed to be. And so the meeting's going fine. And suddenly a door opens, and they join us, President Reagan and Frank Carlucci. The president sits at his place, Frank sits at his place. And he scribbles a little note, and he sends it around the table to me. And he says, the president is absolutely pleased with you. You're now the National Security Advisor. I'd never had an interview. We had never discussed it. And that was the case. I was the National Security Advisor.
You got the job.
I got the job, and I had to be reappointed by the Senate. Even though it was the National Security Council, I was an active duty military officer. And one of the senators said, well, we shouldn't have another, sounds familiar to what's happening now, but we shouldn't have an active duty military officer as National Security Advisor. And we see an article in the New York Times where General Powell himself is on the record saying that the National Security Advisor should not be an active duty officer. And so they attacked me on it, and then one senator in particular wanted to demand my resignation from the Army, or I couldn't be the National Security Advisor. And they said, well, you said the same thing. I said, I agree. I don't think the National Security Advisor should be an active duty officer. But the president doesn't feel that way.
So
I got appointed.
you got appointed. So at the end of the Reagan administration, you went back into the field and you got the command to, you went to...
I went to Atlanta, Georgia
Atlanta,
for a brief period of time, and Alma and I were settled in a beautiful home in Fort McPherson, Georgia. It lasted about 4 months. Once again, something intruded.
You were asked by President George Herbert Walker Bush to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Right, through Secretary Cheney, who was my boss.
And so you accepted that, and that's the highest job you can get in the
It's
military?
not, you don't say no
Right.
to that job. No.
So you had that job for a while, and then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and you were charged with the decision about how to proceed. And was that very difficult to decide how to come up with a strategy? And was it clear in the beginning that we were going to do an invasion?
It wasn't clear what we were going to do right away. In those first 2 days after the Iraqi army essentially occupied Kuwait, we didn't know if they were going to come further south into Saudi Arabia. Norm and I had been talking about this potential problem for some time, and Norm had plans prepared down at his headquarters in Tampa. And so for the first 24 to 48 hours, everybody had bright ideas. We got to do something, do something. And I kept asking, what are we going to do and why are we doing it? And that was seen as being somewhat resistant and reluctant. And I was designated as a result as the reluctant general in the media. Media always likes, little titles. And it's a designation that I accept. I love it. I am reluctant. But by the Sunday, 2 days, 3 days later, President Bush came back from a conference at Aspen where he met with Margaret Thatcher, among others. He stopped as he was going into the Oval Office, coming out of his helicopter. I'm home and watching it on television, and a reporter says, well, what's going to happen? What are you going to do? And he simply says, this will not stand, this invasion of Kuwait. That gave us a mission right there. And I called Norm and I said, we've got our mission. The first thing we have to do is defend Saudi Arabia and then be prepared, if the president says to kick the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. And so we started moving troops about 2 days later after Mr. Cheney went and got permission from the Saudis.
Well, the Powell doctrine, as many people know it, is the doctrine of use massive force. In other words, if you're going to go to war, make sure you have enough troops to win. So you wanted to have a total of, was it 500,000 troops?
It was 500,000 when we got there, but the way it unfolded was, we said to the president, first mission is to make sure they don't come south. And I don't think they will, but we can't take that chance. Therefore, start flowing troops. 82nd Airborne went over, aircraft started going over. It was a massive logistics operation. We had great logisticians working for us, as well as, a great commander in General Schwarzkopf. And then after 3 months, it was clear that they were not going to come south. They really couldn't have done it. We would have destroyed them. And so I went to the president after conferring with George, with Norm and my other colleagues in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and said, Mr. President, your first mission is accomplished. Saudi Arabia is safe. Now, if you don't want the diplomatic process and political process to unfold and get a solution to get the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, then here's what it will take to kick them out. And it was a very small meeting in the Situation Room. Myself, President Bush, I think Big Jim Baker was there, and Scowcroft and Bob Gates and Cheney. That was about it. And I said, here's what we recommend. And I rolled down a map and showed him another 250,000. And everybody went, oh. But he asked a couple of questions, and he simply said, do it.
Okay.
And we did it. And it's hard to remember now, but we had a Syrian division and an Egyptian division as part of that force.
You had 750,000 American troops.
500,000 Americans, 200,000 others.
And then the war was supposed to, some people, when it was debated in Congress, and the resolution to approve it, I think, only passed 52 to 48.
Right.
Something like that. So it wasn't a slam dunk in the sense that everybody thought, yes, this can be done in 3 or 4 days. People said, I remember, 10,000 Americans will die or come back in body bags. But ultimately, a strategy that was developed was a kind of a tail hook proposal to move around the side. How did that develop? Whose idea was that?
Any infantry captain could have figured that out. There's a lot of people who have taken credit for it. And I give most of the credit to Norm because he was the commander. But both Norm and I knew what we were going to do. There was some fussing around earlier on when they thought we were going to go straight up. But it was an obvious plan, and it was a plan given to us mostly by the Iraqis because they didn't move. They stayed right where they were. And so they were fixed. And once the air war started, they weren't going to be able to move. So we had an enemy that essentially had given us a static target. And we went around it. We thought we were going around it, but here's where the fun really started. Told the Marines who were right in front, attack, but don't get engaged. We don't want to lose Marines for no reason at all. There were 4 Iraqi divisions along the coast. Marines, you're at sea. Just show that you're at sea, but don't go ashore. Marines wanted to invade, like from the shores of Tripoli and halls of Montezuma. I said, no, you just fix them, and we'll go around them. And then the 7th Corps was going to go around. And the funny thing about it all was I'm in the command center the night that the ground war started. We had these huge barriers in front of the Marines in the front, fire traps and barbed wire and mines and you name it. And so I'm waiting for it all to really start rolling. And then my guys come in and tell me, the Marines are through. I said, they're through what? You know, it wasn't a big division going through. It was individual Marine soldiers, privates and corporals, sitting there watching, figured out how to get through the wire and everything else. And once they got through, they opened it up. Marines went pouring through. And we had to call the 7th Corps and said, you better get started fast. The Marines are going to beat you to Kuwait City. And that's what happened.
So there are 2 questions that people often asked at that time about the war when it ended. One, did we end it prematurely because there was the so-called road of death? Or,
yeah.
And we were killing a lot of people as they were retreating to Baghdad. But do you think the war ended prematurely? And secondly, why did you not go into Baghdad and get rid of Saddam Hussein?
Let's start with the first question. It was never the mission given to us by the president, by the United Nations, or by the Congress to go to Baghdad and get rid of Saddam Hussein. We hoped he would fall, but we don't know what would have happened when he fell, who would have replaced him. It was always to kick the Iraqi army or get the Iraqi army to leave Kuwait. If they did it peacefully, it would have been no war. But at that point, we were really anxious to have a war, so there'd be no question about it. And so that was always the mission we had decided upon, and was never a discussion, never any consideration of going to Baghdad, no matter what the press likes to write about. The other question is, should we have fought longer? The morning that I went to see the president, as it was all coming to a close, Mr. Cheney and I went into the Oval Office, and I showed him the situation where we were. And I said, in the next day or two, General Schwarzkopf will be calling with a request for instructions to stop. And he said, it's going that well, and we are pretty much there, yes. And the president said, well, why not stop now? Why are we killing more people on the highway of death, as it was called? Why don't we stop now? Why kill any more people? And so we all thought, well, let's consider that. Called Norm, asked him to check with his commanders and see what they thought. And the word came back, give us time to stabilize the lines, and then we're okay with it. And we stopped it at a little after midnight. And people have debated for years whether that was the right decision or not. And that's a legitimate debate to have. I have no second thoughts about it, but all of the book writers do.
So you stayed on as the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff after President Bush was defeated by Bill Clinton, and you stayed for a while. And one of the
I had to finish my term out. I didn't have to finish it.
You finished your term.
Yeah.
One of the controversial things that was done then was the don't ask, don't tell policy.
Yeah.
And in light of events now, do you think that was the right decision or not the right decision?
At the time, it seemed like the right decision at the time. And President Clinton, when I first met him as president-elect in November of that year, we had a long conversation and he never raised the issue, but I knew it was a burning issue. So I said to him, as president, I know that you have said, you've taken some positions on this issue, but if you are planning to move in this direction, you need to give us time to think this through. It is not a simple matter, and it is not just a matter of an old bunch of generals and admirals who don't see the future. We have a lot of issues with our sergeants, we have a lot of issues with our chaplains, and we have a lot of issues with our family members as to what this does to our communities. So it is not something to be decided just in a moment. And he said, I understand. But the week after he was elected, some of his staff members started pushing actively for this, and it became a big public issue. And it became a huge fight. And it was a lot of fingers pointed at me and the Joint Chiefs, but it was Congress that really was just as stridently opposed, led by Senator Nunn. And we were catching a lot of trouble in the Pentagon. In fact, it all turned finally when all of the members went home on Easter and they heard what the American people thought. And they came back and said, find us a compromise. We don't want to push this. So the compromise we found, which was a compromise, was don't ask, don't tell. Was it discriminatory? Yes. Was it perhaps unfair? Yes. But the military does a lot of things that are not really consistent with liberal policies or constitutional policies. But President Clinton embraced it. He had to get out of that issue. And we got out of it. And we said at the time, both Nunn and I, that if and when the military thought they could handle this major change, then we would support it. And that's what happened several years later when the military studied it under Bob Gates and the new chairman, Admiral Mullen. And they said they think they could handle it. And both Nunn and I at an Aspen conference said we're all for it.
So when you left the military, you received the medal, Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Clinton. And then you wrote a book about your life, My American Story. Journey, sorry, My American Journey.
I gave you a copy, David. Jesus.
I did read it, but I didn't remember the title. American Story might be a better title, but American Journey's not bad either. So it was a gigantic bestseller. And what happened was it was
still selling, David.
Still selling and still available.
2.2 million copies, David.
So it's selling every minute. It's selling. It's always selling. It's a great book. The title could have been My American Story, but My American Journey is okay too. So, but it led to so much speculation that you were really, when you were doing a book tour, you're really kind of saying, maybe I should run for president. How close did you come to consider running for president? Did you come very close, or did you never really come close to that?
It really wasn't maybe I should run. It was, what is going on here? It was perhaps the most difficult, roughly 6 weeks period of my life, because I was torn by, do I have an obligation? What other obligations do I have? Is it the right thing for me? People were pressing me on both do it and not do it. A group of Republicans went out and had a press conference saying not only did they not want me to run for president, they didn't want me in the Republican Party either. And so I was torn, and politically, I was in a box because on social issues, as you can imagine, I'm extremely liberal. But on foreign policy and national security issues, I'm rather conservative. And I worked for many Republican leaders, from Reagan through Schultz, through Frank Carlucci, and all sorts of folks. So my bias was really Republican, but it all came to a head when one morning I got up and had to face this again, and I put my feet on the floor and just said, this isn't you, it's not in you. So I went downstairs and told Alma that I was not going to do it. I was going to stop the speculation. And her simple reply was, what took you so long?
I know Alma wanted you to run, is that right? That's right.
But we get the question for years. It was a 100% decision. There was no question in my mind or her mind.
But in light of...
But if it had been 49% or 51% I wanted to do it, and 49% that she didn't want to do it, we wouldn't have done it.
But in light of events that have occurred, President Obama was elected. Do you think you could have been elected had you chosen to run?
I have no way of speculating.
But no regrets about the decision?
Absolutely not.
Okay. So you became a private citizen. You stayed in the private sector. You did a number of things in the private sector. And then George W. Bush was elected president, somebody you didn't know that well, and he asked you to be Secretary of State. Did you have any hesitancy about taking that position?
No, I almost felt one that I was honored to be asked. And I had said when I declared that I wasn't going to run, but I would do something in service, and I did things in the America's Promise Alliance, which you're familiar with, and other things. But if an opportunity came to serve again, I would do so. And that opportunity came from President-elect George W. Bush. And I knew the whole Bush family, and I pretty much knew what I was getting into. So I readily took the opportunity, took the job.
So where were you on 9/11?
In Lima, Peru, having breakfast with the president of Peru, President Toledo.
So how did you get back?
I was sitting there having breakfast, and we were talking about textile quotas and getting ready for a meeting of the Organization of American States. We were going to vote on a charter of democracy for the Americas when a note was handed to me by my assistant, and it said a plane has just flown into the World Trade Center. It was a small plane. Okay, accident. Huh. Then about 8 or 10 minutes later, he came back in with another note that said, another plane has flown into the other tower. And I said, get our plane. It's a terrorist incident. And of course, I had to round up the crew, I had to round up everybody. So I had about an hour before they'd be ready. So I went to the meeting of the Organization of American States, told my fellow foreign ministers what had happened, told them what the American reaction would be. We would get those who had done this to us, but we are still committed to democracy and to this charter of democracy we're here to approve. And I hope before I leave, you will give me a chance to vote for this charter. And they all said a few words. And then the chairman of the meeting, the foreign minister of Peru, said, I ask for unanimous consent for the charter of democracy. And that's what was done. And then I got on the plane, flew home 8 hours, and almost no communications with Washington, broken radio, not telephone. And landed, made sure the State Department was still there, which it was, and in the good hands of my deputy, Rich Armitage, who you know well. And then I went to the White House to join up with the president and the rest of the national security team.
Ultimately, the strategy was initially to attack in Afghanistan, to, I guess, go after the Taliban and also try to get Osama bin Laden.
It was a little, maybe a little more sophisticated in that the original strategy, which I pushed and said to the president, we're not at war with the Taliban now. It's an awful government, but we're not at war with it. We were not at war with it in 9/10 before we decided to go to war with it now. Let's go deal with what the problem is. The problem is Osama bin Laden. So let's give the Taliban government 3 days before we do anything to turn over Osama bin Laden and all of his people, in which case there will be no conflict, no war. And they didn't. And when they refused to do that, then the war started.
Now, we didn't send 500,000 troops into Afghanistan. We used fewer troops. Do you think had we sent in enormous numbers under the Powell Doctrine, we would have been able to capture Osama bin Laden at that time?
The Taliban disappeared so quickly, and you really don't necessarily need 500,000 people to go look for a couple of guys. There's speculation that there was an opportunity to get them in the mountains of Tora Bora. But for reasons that I've never quite understood, the military commander, General Franks, and the Department of Defense under Mr. Rumsfeld and the CIA couldn't agree on whether or not this was a good target, and so we didn't get him at that point.
Okay.
He escaped.
Subsequently, President Bush decided to invade Iraq in order to get rid of the weapons of mass destruction that he believed and other people believed were there.
It wasn't just a belief, it was a considered judgment of every member
judgment
of the intelligence community.
So at that time, you thought that that war would be over relatively quickly, or didn't think it would be over that quickly?
Oh, I knew it would be over quickly because we had brought that army down in size in the first Gulf War. It wasn't the army it was in 1990.
Right.
And when we beat up the army in 1990, some people wanted to destroy it entirely. That was not my strategy. My strategy was to leave enough of an Iraqi army so that, guess what, Iran couldn't walk in and win the war they had lost years earlier. So there was still an army there, but it was not an army that was anything like the Gulf War army. And so I was quite sure that they could get to Baghdad. But this was now not just a military conflict, it was a political conflict, because as I said to the president, and it has been well reported, almost a famous phrase, if you break it, you own it. If you take out a government, Mr. President, you have become the government.
And it was reported that you accused the Pottery Barn of having that policy.
That's
Did they ever call you about that?
A reporter did that. A reporter did that. It was Friedman did it.
Okay.
But the story, it has a backstory to it, in that it started to be reported that I'd said to the president, the Pottery Barn rule, if you break it, you own it, which almost tracks with what I told him, but I didn't use that. And so suddenly the Pottery Barn became outraged. Because that is not their company policy.
Oh, okay.
You're scaring off all potential customers by saying, if you break it, you own it, you got to pay for it.
Wasn't the case.
So they got mad. And so what I did was I went on television, made a statement. It is not the Pottery Barn rule, but we've given them more advertising than they've ever had in the entire existence of the Pottery Barn.
But you've been around the military and the intelligence world for a long time. How is it that the intelligence community have been so wrong that it turns out there were no weapons of mass destruction?
There were none, zero.
And had we known that, do you think that we would have gone ahead with the
It wouldn't have
invasion?
been a war. It was a huge strategic error on the part of the intelligence community. But when you're the President of the United States and you're facing what you believe is a serious threat, and we had every reason to believe it was a serious threat, and you ask, and the Congress asked for a national intelligence estimate, and the national intelligence estimate comes forward, and it's concurred in with some footnotes. Not everybody agreed with everything, but all 16 intelligence agencies agreed that they had weapons of mass destruction and the capacity to start up everything else they hadn't been doing in the past. The President accepted that judgment. He had to. Congress, months before my infamous speech at the United Nations, months before that, Congress had voted on a resolution that was overwhelmingly supportive of what the President was doing, and if he needed to take military action, they supported it. And then the President's State of the Union contained almost everything that I had in my subsequent speech at the UN, and everybody in the administration and the Congress was using the same information. Right. And then I was asked by the President on a Thursday, can you do this next Tuesday? And I looked at what had been prepared by the NSC, and it wasn't acceptable. They didn't do a good job of writing this. They were supposed to be doing it. So I asked them, can we delay it a bit? No, it's got to go Tuesday because the UN's ready for it Tuesday.
Right.
So we worked 3 days trying to get the best story out of the NIE. And subsequently, after I gave the speech on the 5th of February, in the weeks that followed, it slowly came unglued. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but it was true, that they really did not have the goods. But the CIA insisted through the spring and into the fall that they stood by the judgments they had made the year before.
So you regret making that speech at the UN, or?
I regret that the intelligence was wrong, and of course, I'm the one who gave it the most prominent presentation. That's what I was supposed to do, and it'll be prominently figured in my obituary.
Well, I doubt that. But when you left, you retired after 4 years as Secretary of State, and you went back in the private sector, and you've done many things, but one of the things you've done is to help create the Colin Powell School that was referred to in the video at CCNY. Why is that so important to you?
When I left the State Department, I knew that a little center think tank had been named after me up at CCNY, endowed by a wonderful man by the name of Jack Rudin, who just died a few days ago, wonderful real estate developer in New York. And he just wanted to do something in my name, and I was deeply touched. But it was created in 1997 or thereabouts, and nothing much was going on up there. So I went up to see what was going on after I retired from the State Department. And I sat in the President's conference room with about a dozen students, and they started telling me their stories. And when they got back to me, I was so deeply moved, I said, this is me. Each one of you is me 50 years ago. They were all poor kids, immigrant kids, mostly minority, and they were hungry. And they were not going to fail. And they came from families who had no college graduates, poor working people. I said, this is me, I'm home again. And the school is about a mile from where I was born in Harlem. So I got deeply involved in this small think tank center. And I said, I don't want to be we've got enough think tanks, we don't need any more think tanks. So let's make it a center for service and leadership. And that's what we called it, service and leadership. Let's connect the education they're getting in the academic world with what they're doing in the community, what they're doing for the Harlem community and the broader community. And let's get these young kids, minority and immigrant kids, I say down below 59th Street, so they could see what's going on in the world that they're going to enter. And so after a few years, the center kept growing and growing. And the president of the college, President Cuico, said, I want to expand it to an entire school of City College. And so that's what we did 4 years ago, I guess now, 3-4 years ago. and it's called the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. It's got a third of the student body, 25% to a third, and all the social science departments. And I'm enormously proud of it.
So that's one of your passions.
I have 9 other schools too named after me.
None of the schools are named after
Most of them are in Texas.
Okay. But you've been obviously very involved in making speeches to young people and to motivate them to become productive citizens. One of the things you've done is 1997, you started America's Promise, at which Alma is now chairing.
Chairing, yes.
And just briefly describe, what does America's Promise do?
It's an idea that came alive from George Romney, Mitt Romney's dad, who was the governor of Michigan and also the Secretary of Health, Housing and Urban Development. And as he was ending his life, one of the last things he said was, you know, we ought to do something for all of our kids. We have so much treasure and potential in this country. Why is it we have kids who are in such need? So we ought to do something. And then he died a little bit later, but the idea stuck. And a couple of years later, in the Clinton administration, beginning of 1997, late 1996, we took the issue to the president, Ray Chambers and some other folks that you know, said, let's do something about this. And we took it to the president, let's have a summit. And we had the President's Summit for America's Future in Philadelphia in April of 1997. All of our living presidents were there, with Nancy Reagan representing President Reagan. And we signed a charter that we ought to help the kids in need, all the kids, not the black kids or the poor kids, but all the kids who are in need. Need can exist in a wealthy community. And we wanted to make it focused, so we just said, let's have 5 promises that we give to all of our children. Every child should have a responsible, caring, loving adult or adults in their lives. In my life, it was a family, it was a preacher, it was coaches, it was teachers. But kids have to have those kinds of adults in their life, or they're going to get the bad adults. Second promise, every child should have a safe place to learn and to grow. Boys and girls clubs. In my case, it was my church, it was the Hunts Point Public Library, it was the Young Men's Hebrew Association that I was a member of. And those are the kinds of places we have for our kids to grow in. And then the third one was every child should have a healthy start in life, health care. And it's still a disgrace, a national disgrace, that not all Americans are covered with universal health care. The fourth one was every child should have a proper education that gives them a marketable skill. And then the fifth one is very important. Every youngster should be given an opportunity to serve others so that service becomes something that goes into their heart and they take into adulthood. And that's what we've been doing with it for the last almost 20 years. Alma's been chairing it brilliantly for the last several years, ever since I left.
So it's going to celebrate its 20th anniversary.
Next April.
So you've had an incredible life. It's a great American journey. And I want to thank you.
What'd you say?
American journey.
Thank you, Richard.
Great American life, too, but a great American journey. So on behalf of all Americans, I want to thank you, and citizens throughout the world, I want to thank you what you've done for our country and what you've done for America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
We're so good at this.
So John's going to come up. Okay, thank you. Okay.
General Powell, we are pleased that your iconic Navy Blue State Departmental windbreaker, which is right over there, hat, and challenge coin will be joining our collection of national treasures. They wonderfully complement the uniform you wore during Operation Desert Storm, which is on view in our exhibition, Price of Freedom, Americans at War. It allows us to share a fuller picture of a great American by joining the statesman with the soldier. So would you please sign away those objects as they become part of the national collection? You have to come up here and sign away.
You guys are good. They actually made us find the provenance for that jacket.
One more.
Okay?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, John.
And you're not quite finished here. So, it's now my privilege, on behalf of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, to present the Great American Medal to General Powell. For his steadfast courage in his convictions, for his commitment to a life of public service and to the furthering of American democracy, for his leadership on the battlefield and statesmanship on the diplomatic front, for his uncompromising principles based on American ideals and ideas. Through these values and achievements, he defined service at the highest level and true meaning of American heroism. Congratulations. And, General, we are honored to present you with this special gift from one general to another, a reproduction of George Washington's leather dispatch case, which General Washington used to carry his most important documents from the Revolutionary War to his death. General, it complements one of our national treasures, General Washington's portable writing desk, and is believed to have been made from the same workshop. And the writing desk is right back there, which is part of our collection. This portfolio is thought to have carried a first printing of the Declaration of Independence and the very first battle map of Yorktown. And we thank the team of expert craftsmen from Colonial Williamsburg for creating this unique piece, and we know it is perfectly fitting that it belongs to you.
Thank you. And I will use it.
Thank you all very much. And David, you have a few words for us?
Just briefly, again, Colin, thank you for your service to our country, and Alma, thank you for your service as well. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Alma. We're very honored to have Colin Powell receive this award, and we're honored that all of you have come to watch it, and those of you who are watching on television. I hope all of you realize that Colin has given enormous amounts of his time and energy and his brain power over the years to our country. He's really a role model for so many others, and what we've tried to do at the Smithsonian is try to honor people like this, because we want people like this to be role models for young people around our country. And ultimately, we hope that people will learn more about the Smithsonian and how we honor American history at this museum, and hope that they will come here to see this museum and to see other museums at the Smithsonian. It's a great national treasure, and I hope everybody here that's here today takes advantage of the opportunity to see some of the treasures we have here and some of the treasures we have at some of the other museums around this mall and at the new Museum of African American History and Culture, which is also part of the Smithsonian. All of you who have contributed to this, thank you very much. All of you who want to contribute to this, thank you in advance for your contributions. And I hope all of you have enjoyed this evening, and now we'll have some time for dessert and reception, but thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you, everybody.